In this video, I want to talk a little bit about how to go about finding bass without the use of electronics. This is something that has been requested multiple times on this channel, as well as over on the Bass Fishing HQ channel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do this kind of in the springtime, in the summer, and in the fall. Now, before we get into it, this video is brought to you by my apparel company, Fin Fishing. And right now over at Fin Fishing, I have kind of a BOGO deal going on for the month of March. If you buy one of my USA made sun shirts, which is one of the only ones made here in the US, or a pair of the newer duck shorts, this is a water resistant, stretchy, lightweight, highly durable pair of shorts, you will actually get a free Buzzer Rocks Bloodstop formula. So this is a pretty cool product in itself. If you guys have ever hooked a bass in the tongue, in the gill, and they're bleeding really bad, all you got to do is take this canister out, hit them with a little bit of a spray, and it's going to stop the bleeding. So especially with those fish that are bleeding fairly excessive, this is a way that you can actually save that bass's life, whether you are fishing from the bank and just fun fishing, or whether you're fishing in a tournament and it could mean dollars. So anyways, if you buy a sun shirt or the pair of shorts, all you got to do is add this to cart as well, and you will actually see it free automatically at checkout. So I'll leave some links down below in the description. Shopping over at Fin Fishing, truly the best way to help support this channel, and I greatly appreciate it. All right, let's talk a little bit about fishing without electronics. Now this is something that I, not only grew up doing a lot, there was a long period of time where especially I did not have the use of fancy electronics by any means, but also even to this day, there are times where I just go shut off the units and basically just go out there and go fishing. Now I've actually done a few videos specific to what I'm about to talk about over on Bass Fishing HQ, and they are a lot more well done. I really go through the process of locating bass on bodies of water that I'm very unfamiliar with without the use of electronics. And it's over in my Lake Break series. So I will link those videos at the very end of this one. But I did want to talk kind of briefly about how you go about finding bass without electronics. Now, the first thing that I wanted to say is that if you are not using any type of electronics out there, then you are probably best to stay in shallow water and fish around shallow water cover that you can see with your own eyes. We know that bass get around shallow water cover year round. I mean, almost as cold as it's gonna get, they will be around shallow cover, and definitely as hot as it gets. So to focus on shallow water is really the best thing that you can do. If you want to go out there and fish more off the bank stuff without the use of electronics, I'm not going to say that you're wasting time, but the point of electronics is to help you to be more efficient out there on the water. And even the use of, you can download apps on your phone where you can at least get a really good contour map, and even that can help you as far as fishing offshore. And so really in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about fishing in shallow water, because if you don't have any electronics at all, shallow water is what you want to focus on. Now, in the springtime, it's a little bit different than the summertime, and it's a little bit different than the fall time. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Now, in the springtime, what you're dealing with a lot of times is fish that are in a pre-spawn phase, meaning that they are going up to the bed. Fish that are bedding, they are spawning. And then you have a post-spawn phase. This is kind of the what you go through in the springtime every single year. Now, I'm assuming that if you don't know, if you don't have any electronics, then you're not going to know what the water temperature is. And that's a big thing that can really help you to kind of understand what phase of the spawn you may be in. But with that being said, if you're fishing on bodies of water that are fairly familiar, you're probably going to have a decent knowledge of what phase of the year that the bass are in. And like I've said in other videos, there are going to be specific, for example, trees and plants in your area. For example, around here, there's a type of pear tree. It's a genetically engineered tree called a Bradford pear, but anytime that it blooms and it's super white, I know that most of the bass in my general area are in a pre-spawn phase. They are coming out of kind of their winter holes. So that's something that is not going to be the same no matter where you go across the country, but I'm assuming that most places in the country, I've heard people talk about dogwoods before. We've talked a little bit about yellow flowers like on Kentucky Lake. They all mean certain things that the bass are doing. And so one of the biggest things that you can do is understand what is happening or pay attention to it as it happens throughout the years. Because I'm telling you, that happens for me in pre-spawn. Also, when I see the cottonwood blooming on trees around here, it's always a good topwater bite, and bass are typically in their post-spawn phase. So anyways, those are little keys that can help you to figure out what's going on with the weather. Now in the spring, you know, one of the first things that you can do is check in areas that are spawning grounds. We've talked a lot about this on the channel. I've done full videos on this, but you want to find protected water, shallow water, hard bottom. Like those are the 3 characteristics of finding good spawning areas. If you go up and you're not seeing any fish in those areas, or you're not seeing any beds in those areas at all, whether they look like they're fresh beds or beds that maybe a bass have used recently, then more than likely the bass have not made it up to spawn yet. So you're in more of a pre-spawn phase. Now, the biggest thing when it comes to fishing without electronics in a pre-spawn phase is bass are going to push up in a lot of these spawning areas slowly. There's different groups of fish. Some will get there fast, some will get there slow, but you're gonna have a push of fish of shallow. One of the best things that you can do is kind of figure out where towards the spawning grounds these fish are. Typically, they're going to be getting fairly close. So a lot of times, if you get to a lake, you start in the spawning grounds, you're not seeing a lot of fish in the spawning grounds, just start working the bank out from there. And one of the first things that you can do is find some major pieces of cover that are close to the spawning grounds. This might be a big stump or big laydowns. A big thing that pre-spawn bass get on all the time are docks. If you have docks in some of these different pockets leading in to these areas, those are great places for a bass to kind of stage on before they go up. And you can fish things like spinner baits and chatter baits and jigs all around this cover and catch a lot of those pre-spawn bass. Another thing that you can look at is look at the land itself. A lot of times if you're fishing a lake, especially if you're fishing in a reservoir that tends to have more creek channels in it and river channels in it, you're going to be able to look at the bank and pretty much tell if a bank is on the creek channel side or not. You know, typically those steeper banks are going to hold more pre-spawn bass because a lot of those fish are going to use that creek channel, move into these pockets, and some of the last creek channel swing banks, some of the last deeper water banks before you get to the spawning pockets, those can be absolute gold mines when it comes to fish. And you can catch these fish on crankbaits, again, jigs and spinner baits, kind of your typical pre-spawn lures. A crankbait is going to be something that I do. Now, the big thing with pre-spawn bass is they're not always fixated on bait fish. And even spawning fish, the same thing. This is probably the only time of the year where I'm not super focused on trying to find bait like I am in a lot of the other times of the year. So in the pre-spawn, in the spawn phase, really, if they're in if you check those areas and they're not spawning, then they're probably in a pre-spawn phase, especially if it's earlier in the year. And really, you're going to start working from the pre-spawn areas and just work outwards, work towards the main body of water that those fish are going to be. And just start, really the thing about doing it without electronics, you want to be an efficient fisherman. You want to be able to cast baits. A crankbait's probably going to be one of your best friends because you can cover a lot of different depths with a crankbait. You can cover area very quickly with a crankbait. And I would never, I believe in kind of like a 15-minute rule in bass fishing in general. So I only spend about 15 minutes in a given area / zone, unless it's a really big body of water. You know, you get into some of the like Great Lakes where you could fish one point on an island in a Great Lake all day long. But when I get to a lot of these lakes, you're going to catch fish pretty quick. Usually within about 15 minutes. So that's what I'm going to do. Now, obviously, if the fish are spawning, you're going to be able to see a lot of fish on beds, or you're going to be in spawning areas where you can't see the fish at all, but you're getting bit on what's going to be your number one bait is a soft plastic, whether that's a wacky rig or a Texas rig. That is going to be your best bait when the bass are spawning. And so anyways, I'm going to go through those spawning areas. If I'm getting bit, a lot of times one of the best things you can do while bass are spawning, if you catch a fish that's like a pound, 2 pound fish, what we would consider a lot of times to be the male bass, make sure you make 4, 5, 6 pitches in the exact same area, whether you can see a fish or not, because a lot of times you see this across the country. If you catch that buck bass and you pitch back in there enough times and really soak a bait, sometimes the next bite that you get in that area is a female bass, and she's gonna be a big one. And that a big one depends on the lakes that you fish, and maybe 3 pounds in some lakes and maybe 10 pounds in other lakes. And so that's one of the best things that you can do. If you're getting a lot of bites doing that way, you know a lot of fish are spawning, you can simply run around to a lot of different spawning pockets, bays, coves, and really catch a lot of fish that way. Now, when it comes to the post-spawn, a couple of big indicators that you're gonna see right off the get-go is you're gonna go into some of those spawning areas like we talked about, and what you're going to see a lot of times if they're more in a post-spawn phase is you're going to see a lot of bass fry. If you get into the spawning areas and you see a lot of these balls of fry, a lot of these fish may be in more of a post-spawn phase. So it's, as you can see, a lot of what I do, whether with electronics or not, revolves around a spawning area. I'm gonna go to these spawning areas and I'm going to be able to tell what is going on fairly quickly. And so that's what you can do when you don't have electronics. Now, if you're starting to see a lot of fry, you can focus on the fry itself, because typically if you see balls of fry, there's going to be a male bass, sometimes a female bass, that are guarding the fry. Most of the time the male, sometimes the male bass can actually be big. They're not always just 1.5 pound or 2 pounders. Sometimes they are 2.5, 3.5, 4.5 pounders, and simply casting by those balls of fry with top water baits, swim jigs, wacky rigs, Nico rigs, you're going to be able to catch fish off of fry. And we've seen this time and time again. A great way to catch a lot of fish really quickly is simply targeting fry garters. Now that's gonna last for a couple of week period where you can target fry garters. Now the other thing that you have to think about, if you're seeing a lot of balls of fry, a lot of fish, especially the females, are starting to move away a little bit more out to the main lake, and they will make this, some of them will make this process pretty quickly. So one of the best things you can do, any type of secondary piece of structure or cover, kind of the exact same areas where we talked about with the pre-spawn fish as they're staging, as they're moving up, some of these areas can be good again in the post-spawn as those females are starting to move out. Now, the other thing that you have to realize, and this happens kind of late spring, early summer, is that there's going to be bluegills that start to spawn in our bodies of water. And anytime you have a bluegill spawn, you're going to have some fish that relate to a bluegill spawn. If you go in and you see an active bed, a bluegill bed is extremely easy to see, typically with your own eyes. It's gonna look like a honeycomb on the bottom. You know, bluegills are colonial spawners, meaning that they spawn in colonies, in clusters. So you're going to be able to see them, and if you see an active bed, meaning there's a lot of fish on the bed itself, then start looking around for bluegill beds and targeting that bluegill bed specifically. Casting on the edges of that bluegill bed or on pieces of cover that are close to that bluegill bed. Maybe it's a dock, maybe it's a stump, maybe it's a laydown, maybe it's a grass patch. A lot of times you're gonna have those female bass hanging around the edge of those bluegill beds and being able to shoot up, grab a bluegill for itself, and then kind of hang out. And so that's actually a pattern that you can focus on as an angler without electronics the entire year around the moon phases. You typically see most bluegills on beds when you have a full moon. So simple thing you can do before you get to the lake in the summertime, check Google real quick, see if you have a full moon. Also, you may have just noticed, hey, we had a full moon last night. If that is happening, I can almost guarantee there are some bluegill beds somewhere on your lake in shallow water, and you're going to be able to target those fish. And typically the ones that you catch in the summertime off bluegill beds are the big ones. I'm not saying you can't go out and catch small ones, but I'm saying there's big ones around these bluegill beds because big bass like to have a big snack that's easy to get. And a bluegill that's stationary, that's big and fat, is an easy snack. And so that's a great pattern, something that I look for all the time in the summer. Now we're kind of getting into the summertime a little bit. Now, summertime is traditionally a time where you use a lot of electronics to go out there and catch a lot of fish. But if you're doing it without electronics, again, I'm gonna say stick to shallow water and or stick to heavy cover. Bass, as that temperature gets really hot in the summer, are going to relate to heavy cover year-round, specifically vegetation. If there's any type of vegetation in your lake, whether that's lily pads or matted vegetation, or maybe it's offshore milfoil that you can see with your own eyes, those are places where you can find giant schools of bass. And so then it becomes, again, an efficiency thing. You want to fish as many as you can, and typically the best pieces of heavy cover during the summer have one main ingredient, and that's some sort of bait fish. Bait fish, whether that's bluegill or shad, and you can't always see the bluegill and the shad, but typically you can either hear them. Like a lot of times if you're fishing in shallow water, like lily pads or matted vegetation, you're gonna be able to hear bluegill on the bottom of the mat snapping off bugs, popping. You'll hear that popping. That at least indicates to you that there's bait in the area for a bass. Now, whether a bass is there or not, that's just something you're gonna have to experiment with. And again, the more water you can cover, the more likely it is that you're going to run into an area that has fish. Now, when it comes to shad, sometimes you will definitely see shad and bait fish, especially in the evening times or early in the morning times. If you have really slick water conditions, you can a lot of times visibly see the balls of bait on the surface in these lakes. And so it can really cue you into at least knowing, hey, there's a lot of bait in this area. Now let's target the heavy cover that's really close to here, and it might help me to start getting a lot of bites. So bait fish really become a big key. And sometimes in the summertime, one of the biggest keys you can do is just get there really, really early in the morning because this is a primary time for bass to feed, and you're going to hear them feed. You're going to hear them, you're going to see them with your own eyes, I mean, busting on the water. And if you have those really calm conditions in the morning, the other thing is that you can hear from a distance. You will hear hundreds of yards away fish schooling at times. That might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but from a ways away, you're going to be able to hear fish. And sometimes just hearing one fish blow up on bait fish is all you need the rest of your day. Now, for some of you beginner anglers, there is a humongous difference in the sound that a bass makes when it is chasing bait and when a carp breaches the surface. If you guys have a lot of like common carp in your bodies of water, in the morning time specifically, I don't know why it is, they just like to jump. I would love, I'm sure I could just look it up on Google, but these stupid carp will jump just randomly. They just jump out of the water. It's a very specific sound. A lot of times when a bass, you can almost hear the suction as they try to inhale. It's a very different sound than basically a big splash. And I don't know how many beginner anglers, even intermediate anglers that I talk to when they're like, man, the bass were jumping everywhere today and I just couldn't get them to bite. And I don't always have the heart to just tell them, dude, those were probably carp, especially when they're like 6 and 7 pounders. Like that many big bass are not just going to randomly breach. There's a very discrete difference. And a lot of times with bass chasing, if you can visibly see it, like you will literally see wakes across the surface. Carp just come up, breach, go back down. Bass is going to really, you'll see a wake in the water. Another thing that happens at times is catfish. Catfish will also trick you at times because they make these little miniature swirls. Even big catfish will make these little bit of miniature swirls on the surface of the water. And I don't always know what catfish are eating, but I've seen it at times where they just come up to the surface, whether it's a bug they're eating or whatever, and then they don't make a big commotion. It's just all of a sudden you'll see this boil, this little this little swirl. And I remember a long time I chased a bite thinking that I was around bass and realized that they were all catfish. And so that's another thing that happens a lot in the summer. But in the summertime, one of the best things is looking for heavy cover. In the form of vegetation specifically, but even heavy cover like big docks or laydowns. Another thing is current. Some of your bodies of water, you're going to be able to visibly see current. Where current is hitting the bank, especially like where you have current swinging up against the bank, if there's any type of piece of cover that kind of kicks out there and it creates that eddy, those fish are going to be right behind that eddy or on the front side of that eddy. A lot of times your most active bass is going to be on the front side of a piece of cover where that current is hitting. So that's another thing that you can look for. Current, heavy cover, and a lot of times shade. Shade is a humongous thing that you can simply look for in the summertime. Running around looking for shade pockets. I like to kind of wait until about 10 o'clock a lot of times in the summertime, because if you get to the lakes, when it comes to targeting shade. When it comes to targeting shade, if you wait till about 10 o'clock, those shade pockets shrink. And so the bass that are in them have to be confined to a smaller area. So then you can pinpoint them a lot easier. And so that's gonna happen really good between about 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. It's a great thing to do in the middle of the day. Simply go run around and target shade pockets. So that's something that I do a lot in the summer. Like I said, there's a lot of fish that are behind you in the summer. A lot of them are offshore, but those are some things that I'm definitely gonna do in the summer. Now, in the fall time, in most bodies of water, we talked about this a lot this past fall. In a lot of bodies of water, I shouldn't say most, in a lot of bodies of water, you're going to have a fall turnover, where the bottom layer of water that is pretty cold and no oxygen flips with the top layer that is really warm and highly oxygenated. Now, when that flip occurs, what it simply does is it spreads the bass out. They can be anywhere and everywhere. Also in the fall time, you have bait fish that are every frickin' where. It doesn't matter if you see balls of bait a lot of times because they're everywhere. They're all over the place. And I've talked about it time and time again. The best thing that I have ever done is simply picked up a whopper plopper or some sort of topwater, maybe a buzz bait, and just burn the bank. That is what I do still, even with fancy electronics in the fall. That spring, that turnover, all the way through fall, this is something that you can do, is just burn down banks with a topwater bait. And a lot of times you're not looking for schools of fish. You're trying to pick off one fish here, one fish there, one fish in the back of this, one fish on the main lake point. That's how you go about fall fishing a lot of times. When I stopped worrying about finding patterns in the fall, I started catching a lot more fish consistently because I knew that I was going to go out there and do a lot of junk fishing. You know, topwater is a great one. Square bills and spinnerbaits can be good in off-color water as well, but I'm going to use a topwater an awful lot in the fall time. It's my #1 bait in the fall for sure. So I know that's kind of a lot of information to digest, and there's so much more that we could talk about when it comes to fishing without electronics. So many specific things. So if you guys have anything that you want to know specifically, let me know down below in the comments. Maybe I'll make a video specific to it if enough of you guys want to know. So, all right, guys, hope you enjoyed this one, and I will see you tomorrow.